Hi, everyone, and welcome to Unit 11. Um, Almost done. Congratulations. Research Methods IHMN 315. This unit, we're looking at reporting and use of research. So basically, once you've done the research, what do you do with it afterwards? Today, starting off with a bit in the news and looking at talking about your field research. Then we'll talk about reporting and use of the data. Such things as presenting the data, publishing results, and doing recommendations. To begin with, though, you've got your field research, and some of you may have already started working on it, others maybe not. But just wanting to go over a few things that you may want to be thinking about with your field research. First off, presentations are due November 29th, midnight. Okay, so make sure you get them in. And it's an opportunity for you to try to carry out some real research. So it's supposed to be fun, hopefully, something enjoyable, something to give you a chance to see what it's actually like to carry out research. But just remember, this is going to be a mini project. So to give you an example, in a real research project, a real qualitative research project, maybe you would be expected to do, 15, 20, 25 interviews. Well, all I would hope for is maybe 5 or 10 at the most. Okay. If you're doing quantitative research, where you might be typically expected to do 400 surveys, quantitative surveys, really maybe 50 at the most. But just to get a real sense of what it's like to carry out research. Once you've done it, it's an opportunity for you to do a bit of analysis on that research, make sure you're linking it back to your research objectives, things like that, and to share your findings. What you're going to do is you're going to do a voice-over presentation, whether it be PowerPoint or whatever you're most comfortable with. Make sure that there's at least 6 slides. You'll probably have more, but there's at least 6 slides. And on at least one of those slides, what I want you to do is talk about what you learned from this process. So, because with every bit of research, and every time you go out and do research, there's always something you learn in the process that you would do differently the next time, or that something worked really well and you want to share that what worked out really well. So, however you want to do it, just make sure that you've got at least one slide with lessons learned, roughly about 10 minutes in total length, so not a really long presentation. But that will still give you plenty of time to hopefully go through what you discovered. And you may need to load this online and then share the link with the Dropbox, because quite often I've found in the past that Moodle can be a bit of a pain. It won't let you load a very large file. So in that case, you may have to put it on the cloud somewhere, or even do the YouTube channels like I've been doing, and just share the link on the Dropbox. Okay? A few things in the news. And for those of you that have not been there before, what you're seeing there on the image is the Wickaninnish Inn in Tofino. So, reported in the news with all of the shutdowns that are going on right now here in British Columbia, and the restrictions on travel. A bunch of the businesses in the Tofino Euclid area have decided to temporarily close. Places like the Wickaninnish Inn, the Crystal Cove, Ocean Village, etc. And while they're saying they're going to be closed for the next couple of weeks, it kind of depends on where the numbers go with coronavirus. So, more implications, more impacts from the virus. Um, So this interesting story about crowdfunding to uh, do some eco accommodations in Tulum in Mexico. Um, Absolutely gorgeous area, by the way. And this is the first time that I've ever heard of something like a crowdfunding to build these accommodations. So might be interesting kind of new ways of financing projects. And finally, the Boeing 737 MAX has been cleared in the US. Nowhere else yet, but it has been cleared in the US. And that's the plane that had the two fatal crashes that initially grounded all of the 737 MAXs around the world. And an issue with some of the new technology and training and software and things like that. Um, the Federal Aviation Administration in the US has gone up on the plane. They've test certified that it's safe. However, still some people and a lot of travelers that when we can travel again might be hesitant to fly on that plane. So, kind of implications there, and something that people will be impacted for a while with that plane. Right. Reporting and use of the research. This is kind of a reminder that research isn't finished. Um, After you've done your analysis, there's still the important element of getting that research out. You know, as Yogi Berra, it ain't over till it's over. You need to communicate your findings to the relevant audiences, and you need to communicate it in a way that will resonate, that will be understood and interpreted by the audience that you're communicating it to. And so, different audiences you'll find have very different requirements and needs. So, for example, if you're presenting to an academic audience, quite often there's fairly strict rules that you're going to follow, what's expected, what you have to do, what you have to provide, even down to the whole APA and presenting your resources, things like that. And quite often with an academic audience, there's a real focus on how the research was conducted, the methods used, because your academic audience is really looking for those, to verify that the research was conducted properly. Whereas your business audience, quite often they're more concerned about the implications. What does it matter? And in particular, what does it matter or how does it matter to me? What can I do with this information afterwards? So, quite a different focus there between those academic and business audiences. Regardless of who you're going to present to, your report needs to be readable, believable, and usable. So you always want to make sure that somebody can go through it, that they are actually going to listen to what you've said and do some use with it. For me personally, the last thing I want to do is do up some research report that just sits on a shelf somewhere. So, and what that means then sometimes is you may actually have to create different reports for different audiences. And in the past, for example, one of the things that we had to do was we actually had to do a video presentation for a group of people that we knew probably would never ever get around to reading the report. We would have short presentations. We would have summaries, things like that, depending upon who we were writing that report to. You definitely need to be thinking about who your audience is. And your final audience, the people that you're presenting this to, can really determine the structure, how you're going to report that information, what method you're going to use to present it. A technical business report, for example, as we said, very different needs and goals, very different expectations inside the report than an academic report. So you really need to be thinking about, and if you've got a sponsor especially, writing it to their needs. You always want to have clear and English, uh, but you also need to be thinking about what is that sort of academic level of the people that you're presenting that report to. And it's really helpful if you've got all of those expectations clear before you even start the research, just so that you know what sort of language, what people are expecting to see, things like that. In this presentation, you'll see a few different YouTube things, presentations to go to. One of the things I just wanted to point out is this Hans Rosling. He's got some phenomenal presentations on the internet. So if you type in his name, you will see some different presentations by him, and all of the techniques, the way that he presents is very engaging, very easy to see, very easy to read. Not sure where the technology is that he uses, but it's definitely memorable the way he presents. So check him out. If you're going to go publish your results, um, there's lots of things to consider with that as well. For example, anybody that's participating in your research, you're probably going to need to give them anonymity. At a bare minimum, you need to make sure that you've got their permission before you would ever report them or anything that they've shared with you. It's important also to remember that your research sponsors, whoever is paid for that research, may need to give you approval before you can go to publish it. So it's important to check with all of your funding sources before you go thinking about publishing results. Don't forget to thank anybody that helped you. If you had assistance from others, make sure that you say thank you to them. Any information that you've borrowed from other sources, always be very clear where you got it from. And quite often, it's better to err on that side of caution and over-report any borrowed information. This kind of further emphasizes that whole APA, the formatting stuff that you've been learning, that you've been applying with all of your academic stuff here. It's very important for sure to make sure that you properly referenced everything that you have in your reports. Other things to think about. Sexist language can be either ambiguous or offensive, so make sure you avoid the use of it. For example, you would never say businessmen, firemen, anything like that, because it generally would just be towards the male genders. So you want to make sure you're trying to be as gender neutral as possible. Business people, fire person, things like that. Anything that's quoted, make sure that you have personally checked and verified with where did those quotes come from. If you were the one that gathered them, make sure you verify back with the person that you were doing the research with to verify that that quote is valid. If you're gathering it from another source, make sure you go back to the original source, because a lot of misquotes can get carried on, and that sort of that error gets carried forward and over again. And this can happen in quite a few cases, but I'll just give you some, I guess, some fun examples. These are some very famous misquotes. You'll probably recognize the first one: Luke, I'm your father, off of Star Wars. Beam me up, Scotty, from Star Trek. Play it again, Sam. This is probably one you have not heard before. It's from the movie Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart. Or Elementary, My Dear Watson, Sherlock Holmes. All of those are common things that are said or referred to, and none of them actually are in any of the things. For example, instead of Luke, I'm your father, Darth Vader says, no, I'm your father. Beam me up, Scotty was never used. Closest was Scotty, beam me up. Play it again, Sam, was not said. It's play it, Sam, play as time goes by. And elementary, but it was never elementary, my dear Watson. He might have said, my dear Watson, but never together with elementary, Sherlock Holmes. So you can see how things, and when it comes to using things in research, if you don't go back to the original, if you use, as cited by somebody else, you may find out that in the original use of that information, the original quote, it's actually quite different, or even the interpretation is quite different. So always best to go back to the original. If you happen to be reporting your research in an academic journal, quite often most academic journals will actually have a set of guidelines and standards that are available that will tell you exactly how they want their the report, and as long as you follow it, then you can get it published. They will, but not all journals have the same guidelines. At conferences, again, they will quite often have certain expectations, what they want to see in the report or in your paper, your presentation, things like that. So always best to check with the organizers of the conference to find out how they want the presentation or the report provided. Here's a few hints if you're revising your drafts, and this applies not only for research reports, but for all sorts of different work that you might be doing. First off, read the text all the way through. Think about what you're trying to say, to whom, who's your audience, things like that. Read it through carefully to make sure that you're actually carefully reading through all the different words and not skipping over things. Think about any big changes first. One technique that I use, and I know this uses up paper, but I will actually print out the entire document first and look to make sure that it flows properly. And if I feel that I need to move things around, I'll move some of the different sections around. After you've got things in the right order, in the right area, make sure that you're using the right words, the right language, sentences. Your sentences should not be huge run-on sentences. Keep them shorter, keep them specific, easy to understand. Occasionally using lists and bullets can help improve readability, and try to be more positive than negative. Instead of saying, don't do this or it can't be this, you should try to gear it more towards it should be this something else. Once you've got that far, put it away, walk away from it a little bit, and then look through it again. Just a few specific ones. If you're writing a technical report or a consulting report, make sure you're very clear what's expected before you even start. And if you're doing any research for another organization, you need to be very clear what's expected, not only of your research, but in the report itself. So if you can get a handle on any examples, make sure you do that. An executive summary is very important in a technical report. You want to keep it short, to the point, but remember that you need to give all of the key information because it might be the only thing that some of the key people ever read. So, make sure that it tells all of the very key, most important information that you want them to get out of it. If you have information, extra data, things like that, that are not immediately relevant to the research, throw it into the appendix. The best rule of thumb for things like that is if you need to know the information to understand the research, then it should go in the body. If it's nice to know information, if it's things that aren't absolutely positively required to understand the research, then throw those sorts of things into the appendix. And if there's enough of it, at times you may even have to publish the appendices as a totally separate document. But that way it keeps the body of the report focused and much easier to digest. Qualitative research is very, kind of a unique set of circumstances when you're reporting qualitative research. The issue with that is that there's no real exact format for an kind of expected way of presenting qualitative information, especially since there's different types of qualitative reports depending upon how you did the research. So you do have to kind of work your way through qualitative reports a bit more than with quantitative. There's a bit more standards when it comes to quantitative research. Most important with qualitative research is the context, the environment, the situation, because quite often all of that context is very important to understand when it comes to interpreting the information. So if you don't provide the context, the environment that surrounds this, the qualitative research, it can be very difficult to understand and support the few things to remember, and I won't go through all of this, but just to really think about what you're providing and again focus on who, what, why, where, when, and how with the qualitative research. Now, quantitative data, things like that. Lots of different ways for you to present quantitative information. So I'll be showing you a few examples in just a moment, but you want to make sure that it's not overwhelming, that it's easy to understand, and whatever tool, whatever method you decide to use, Make sure that you're using it for the right reasons and very clear that it's just a communication tool. So the information is the thing that needs to be focused on, not necessarily the way of presenting it, because you don't want the method to overwhelm the information or the message that you're trying to communicate. And it is good to have some variation, but the more variation that you put into a report, especially a quantitative report, the more work it is for the reader because they have to learn every new way of that information being presented to them. Images can be a phenomenal way to present information. This right here, this is actually a study that occurred in Australia. They put GPS trackers onto cats and they wanted to show to their owners just how much these cats were wandering around the neighborhood. And if they had just described it or talked about it, it would not have had the power and the influence as these images do with showing graphically just how far afield these cats were wandering. When it comes to bar charts and this sort of nature, an important way of presenting information in a bar chart is to make sure that the data is going, the bar charts are going down in that sort of fashion. And you can see within each one of these categories, so here's a new category, that's why it starts new again and goes down. Next category. So within each one of these sections, you can see it's been organized to go down in that sort of fashion. Now, for this sort of bar chart, it didn't matter, these were all categorical. So these were all categories, for example, of the travel agent or the airline or things like that. This is very different than something like this. Because these bar charts are talking about time periods, it's more important that this part of the bar chart goes down. So in this case, from the earliest date all the way down to the latest date of category. And even if that means that these bars kind of go in and then out again, that's fine, because it makes more sense to have it go from that upper time period down to this lower time or the greater time period than if you were to move it all around. So again, timing will change how you present the bar charts. Pie chart. When you've got a population and it's got to add up to 100%, this is where a pie chart makes good sense. And you can see also this one, they've colored it green, kind of that nature inspired. So a nice connection there, make that stand out. One of the other things that they did with this pie chart is they made it 3D and they leaned it back a bit so that it wouldn't take up as much space, and they were able to have all of these information squares that talks about each one of the groups. So this one pie chart provides a lot of information. Where it's relevant, putting all of your information onto a map and showing that way so that somebody can look at all of the information for the entire map at once can be useful. This was a map that we used for a destination management plan, and it helped to really highlight the area and show off where we were doing the research. So you can see all of Canada, and then it narrows down to this one small section of Alberta that we were actually doing the research in. With this chart, you can see there's kind of a hierarchy of all of these first groups lead up to this next layer, or almost like a hierarchy, which leads up to this top group. So again, by putting all of this into one, you can follow all the different arrows and connections that leads up to that top set of values that are important. Infographics can be very useful to, again, present a lot of information all in one place. And when you do something, for example, like these sort of dials at the bottom, and by putting them all on the same scale, it's a very quick and easy way for somebody to go through these and compare, in this case, all these different types of groups. So you understand in one very quick graphic what's important, which one of those groups, in this case, are the high spenders. And finally, I just want to show you a couple by presenting again on this sort of map situation, plus having some bar chart information down in this bottom corner. This one infographic has a ton of different information all presented in one group. One problem with this one, or this and the next one that you'll see, is on this total arrivals, they've gotten very specific, 2,191,288 total arrivals. When they came to this next one, September 2018, they summarized it to 2.1 million. So it wasn't as easy to figure out the exact number and to make that year over year comparisons. But again, this one chart, this one infographic has a ton of information all presented at once, and you can make some nice comparisons by looking over the entire chart. Here's another really interesting presentation to check out. A guy by the name of Chris Jordan, who takes statistics and creates different art images and very powerful, very impactful art images that presents a lot of good information, but in a way that really stops and makes you think. So definitely check out his presentation. When we're talking about reports, professionalism is critical to the uh, the power and the amount of influence that a report will have. So making sure that all the spelling and grammar errors are cleaned out. If any of you were ever wondering why we're fairly hard or we can be fairly hard on things like spelling and grammar, it all comes back to this whole professionalism and the amount of validity and weight that these reports will have. Be sure to always use, the spell check and the grammar check in your Word document, making sure that you're using the correct base language. So if it's a report for here in Canada, making sure that you're using Canadian English and not American English. And, vice versa if you're writing a report for people in the United States. Just as a very quick, I guess, story or an example, um, when I worked with the Canadian Tourism Commission, we would have these requests for proposals, and people would submit research proposals to us trying to get research contracts. And if I found numerous spelling or grammar errors in their proposal, quite often those companies did not get the contract. They might have been very good researchers, I don't know, but I felt that if I couldn't trust them to write a good proposal, I could not necessarily trust them to write a good report. So it's very important to go through and get somebody else to proofread your report for you. It's very easy if you've written the report for you to skip over things or think that things are very clear when they're not. So, get a second or even a third set of eyes looking through it. When it comes to recommendations in a report, um, very important to say first off that not all reports will have recommendations. And even if you think you have some recommendations, not all reports should have recommendations. So it comes back to that whole expectations. What are people hoping or expecting to see in the report? If you do have recommendations, though, make sure that they're very easy to understand. They're practical, so you're taking the perspective of the audience again, who's ever going to be reading, who you're writing the report for. And most important is that there's a clear connection between any recommendations that you've given and findings that you've got in the report. If you can't clearly link a recommendation to something in your findings, then it rapidly loses any credibility. It's important when you're writing up your report that you're distinguishing between findings, interpretations, judgments, and recommendations. So findings, those are just the basic things that you saw, recorded, observed, whatever was gathered in the actual process. No interpretation, it's the raw data or the summarized data from the research. Interpretations are how you read or how you understand those findings. And it's interpretations and judgments can be fairly similar. Essentially, it's you reading through the findings and making the connections. You're interpreting what you see there, using your professional judgment, making decisions, things like that. And then the next step being a recommendation. So a recommendation being taking that interpretation, taking that understanding of the information and saying, okay, this is what I would expect you to do with this information. So they're very different, and you need to be very clear when you're talking about all these different elements. Make sure that you've given yourself enough time um, to provide those recommendations and to really think about those recommendations, plus to give the client, whoever you're writing the report for, enough time to think about and understand the recommendations. Sometimes you want to be able to provide options. So it's not always a clear black or white, um, only one way to do this sort of recommendations. You may want to give A, B, C options for your recommendations. It's always important before any recommendations go into a report, though, that you've already talked things through with whoever is paying for the research. Because, first off, they may not want recommendations in the report. Secondly, uh, your recommendations may not be feasible, they may not be even possible. And what can happen sometimes, though, is the minute you put something in as a recommendation, there might be an expectation that those recommendations will be followed. So you have to be very careful about putting recommendations in a report, especially if you're writing the report for somebody else. And finally, with a recommendation, make sure that who's ever going to have to implement those recommendations, that you've included them in the development, in the discussion, in the reporting of those recommendations. Uh, you'll get a much higher likelihood of somebody carrying through and actually carrying out your recommendations if you have them involved in that process. As you can see, there's a whole range of other ways of presenting your research results. Um, you can do oral presentations, face-to-face conference calls, webinars, everything like that. You can post them electronically, like all of you are going to be doing with your PowerPoint, the VoiceOver PowerPoints. You can do workshops where you might actually bring a group of people together and actually hands-on deal with the research, create pamphlets or guides, short videos potentially, and you may even do a news or a press release with the media. All of these different methods of communicating your research will require that you have a slightly different perspective, a slightly different message, a slightly different way of presenting that information. So you need to you need to target your presentation, your information, your report based on whatever type of media, what method you're using to present the information. And in fact, you will be taking a course on digital communications in the BA-GTM program. And in that, your instructor will also talk to you about different methods of digital communication and how different forms of digital communication are used for different types of communication. So Just want to quickly mention a few things about a press release and media. Press releases can be used to spread information across a variety of audiences. Now, press releases have certainly changed. Used to be your typical, print and TV and radio, but now social media, of course, is one of the keys. Although social media picked up by TV or other broadcasts can really amplify social media. And thinking about the scope, how far and wide, and sometimes nowadays, you're not in control of how far and wide your message will be going. One issue with press releases, though, is once you've put it out there, you lose control of that final story. So you have to be very careful. Because media is kind of competing with other media, there's a real issue about whether or not your story is newsworthy enough. And sometimes it's even a matter of, do you have it on the right day? What other stories are hitting the news right now? So, but if you want to increase the likelihood of your message being picked up by the media, make sure you're choosing the right media. Make sure that you're putting it into a format that is preferred by them. So understanding how they use, what sort of format they use, and make sure that the theme of your information fits with the theme or the overall image of that media. Finally, a few more videos for you guys to check out and different ways of presenting information. The bottom two again is by that same person, Hans. Some really neat technology, really neat ways of presenting the information. And then the first one just about how information was used to make some decisions about crimes. So, a few final thoughts on presentations. Remember, you're not the audience. You're not doing this presentation for you. You're doing it for who's ever going to be reading the report or whoever you're presenting the information to. So always think about them first. Make sure that you give yourself enough time to make any revisions that might be necessary. If you've test run your report or your presentation on kind of a test audience, make sure there's enough time for you to fix things. Again, trial run your report, your presentation, get some feedback, get some second and third eyes on the information, and learn from the good and the bad. So it's sometimes as important to see some bad presentations and figure out what did not work, as well as finding some good presentations and seeing what does work for you. Okay? And, Yoda, do or do not. There is no try, but I want all of you to just try. Try out different ways of presenting your information. When you're doing your presentations, when you're doing any of this sort of work at a school level, at the university level, now's your chance to try out new things, test new ways, because The downside is very minimal at this stage in your life, in this stage of your career. So just try new things when you have the opportunity. Finally, thank you. I just want to thank all of you for your engagement, for your interest in research methods, in conducting research, and in the school in general, in the whole craft and of research and tourism and hospitality career. So thank you very much and enjoy your field research. Take care.